It gives me great pleasure to celebrate with you the birth of a book. But it took more than 9 months, apparently. It took 3 years. Most academic books take longer than the 9 months would like them to take. This is the fruit of, to some extent, to a large extent, the fruit of a workshop that was convened by this institute, Paris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, the year 2010. I had a look at the book. I read two chapters. I won't tell you which ones, but it's a very rich book as it looks, with a critical eye at the evolving, not just role of UNRWA, but its self-understanding and then the public perception. I'll say a word or two on public perception. I'm very pleased to see that you've got 4 people that are most qualified to comment, not just on this book, but on what is behind. People who we're honored to have Filippo Grandi with us in the Institute. He's someone who knows UNRWA inside out. He's someone who's tried to reform UNRWA, notwithstanding all the difficulties. All of us know how difficult it is for an organization which is not well funded, to say the least, how difficult it is to expand and do things that they need to do, like, work more on the protection of the Palestinian population. So we have a legal advisor who knows also, who can bring in his perspective on this transformation of UNRWA. Then we have, of course, Sari, who's not only an editor of this book, one of the 3 editors, but whose commitment and work for the Palestinian community, with the Palestinian, and his an insider outsider is part of the struggle of the Palestinian community, but also an academic observing the transformations, difficulties faced, and the promises. And Nasser is our research director. He will hopefully, and I'm very certain, will bring another fresh look into this. I won't say much except that as someone who was for some time in government, and I knew that UNRWA was dealing with healthcare and schools in Palestinian camps, and they were doing their work within the limits of the finances they had. And at times, the Palestinians were complaining not about the way UNRWA does things, but about the fact that UNRWA is not doing enough. They wanted UNRWA to do more, but UNRWA couldn't do more because of the limitations we all know. But when I was in government, I discovered another sort of personality of UNRWA, which I liked. That is the advocacy. And in this country, the Palestinian community in the camps need advocates, not just Palestinian advocates. They need more Lebanese advocates to fight for their civil and political rights. And UNRWA was precious to those of us who wanted to fight that fight. They always gave us information, insights. They interpreted the needs of the Palestinian community to those of us in government who wanted to change. Failed. I think Lebanon, unfortunately, I think it's also said somewhere in the book, in one of the chapters I wrote, Lebanon doesn't score very high unfortunately, on respecting the civil and human rights of the Palestinian community. Let's hope that the discussion among the panelists, but with the audience, will touch on this. And as a policy related institute, I'm also pleased to see Ambassador Samir Khouri, who's into proposing for policy changes regarding refugees in Lebanon. I hope that the discussion will come up with a few recommendations for us to work on in the near future. I welcome you all, and I hope, unfortunately I won't be with you for the whole discussion, but I hope you will have a very good discussion. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Tariq, for the presentation. My name is Sari Hanafi. I am one of the editor of the book. Usually I edited 8 books in my life, and every time I edit a book, I swear I would never repeat it. I would say this is the only book. It was really a pleasure to work with Lex Steckenberg and Leila Hilal. I mean, they are so liberal. Okay, we don't. You can imagine Lex Steckenberg has a position on UNRWA, and many articles written in this book is really critical, especially my article, my chapter, very critical. So, and we test our capacity to be liberal, and it works. Okay, not often, as I said like this. So, as Tariq remind us that this is really the fruit of a conference in the end of 2010, 2 days conference hosted by IFI here and UNRWA. It was again, it's a nice collaboration to explore a number of themes high on the UNRWA agendas as it prepared itself for the 17th decade of operation, because it marks the 60th anniversary of UNRWA. And especially in a situation where a solution to a plight of Palestinian refugees remained elusive, with a little prospect for progress. The substantive and strategic impetus of the conference focus was a review of some of the main themes being studied by UNRWA at the time related to the future of the refugee questions and the agency. The book is divided into 6 parts. One, of course, a classical UNRWA mandate is a service delivery and the challenges faced this program. Second part is about protection. It's very dear to us, so we put it from concept to practice. The third about camp governance. The fourth, civic participation and community engagement. The fifth, camp improvement, construction and community development. And finally, Palestinian refugees and durable solutions for UNRWA. So let me say that here I will stop reading. To say that UNRWA is amazingly transformed in spite of a fixed mandate. So there is a stretching of this mandate done often by initiative of the goodwill of UNRWA staff. Okay, whether they are Palestinians or international. And this is stretching, I think it was extremely important in the time where really the Palestinian people went through different crises related to occupation, repression, host countries, lack of basic rights, and so on. So it is, I would say, generally speaking, UNRWA is working in a hostile environment. It's very interesting. It's an hospitable environment, but any hospitality, to talk like Jacques Derrida, has hostilities. Okay, so, and this is what makes it very difficult, okay? That how to, yes, Lebanon is hospitable for the Palestinians, but how some fringe of Lebanese society will more paradigmatically be hostile. So how they would manage this hospitality and hostility. So the war on Gaza, the Arab uprising, especially in Syria, the eviction that twice or thirds displaced Palestinian of Syria, and so all these crises, I think what amazed me, me who is very known as a critic of UNRWA, that I would say I am amazed how UNRWA was very adaptive to these crises and contribute in a remarkable way, generally speaking. So, so in service delivery, it's amazing when you look, you step back a little bit and you look about UNRWA role in education and how moved first from it's not connected. No, it's not connected. Okay. Yeah. So, how it moves from dealing with the service, social service, to focus on education and health. And we know now when we see the catastrophe in the making with the Syrian refugees, we realize that the most critical, salient issues is the education, because with the education you can make people in the future generation self-reliant and capable of surviving without the help of international organization. So I think it was extremely important to highlight this move toward the main bulk of the budget is about the education, and then with the health actually, and moving from a basic primary health care program to more sophisticated over time. It is very interesting if I would like to talk about 3 areas where really you have innovations in UNRWA. Is I would say microcredit, and we have in the book an excellent article of Alex Bullock, who is UNRWA staff, but I like so much his comparative chapter comparing the UNRWA program on microcredit with other programs worldwide, and he is himself in the same time the head of the program and critical about the financialization of the sector, if you like, of the operation, and he put himself in the shoes of the subaltern poor guy. I mean, how bring him or her to a modern economy, and what is the consequences. I will. This is the first point. The second point is I think where you have innovation is the question of practice. And maybe I will not talk a lot because Nasser will talk about it maybe, but just I wanted to say really it is extremely important to see some good practice about passive protection. I'm always saying it's not sufficient. I am waiting for UNRWA to be more proactive for the durable solutions, for right of return, supporting basic political demands of Palestinian people. But nevertheless, I think what they did, it was remarkable. The third point, I think, where I found innovations is about camp rehabilitation and camp reconstructions. And here where you find that UNRWA play a major role, UNRWA changed its paradigm from just looking to Palestinians just as body to be fed and to be sheltered in any shelter, to say no, we will have more comprehensive approach to the whole public health of the Palestinians, and specifically until today almost half of the Palestinian refugees live in the camps. Of course, the third live in the 53 official camps, but I would say, for instance, the Yarmouk camps is not considered as a camp. So I would say the half of the Palestinians live in refugee camps, and many of these camps are extremely slum area, so crowded. I mean, just I took my 30 students to Shatila camps last week, and I saw in their eyes they cannot believe, and some of them, they are international students. They know Beirut as a Hamra, if you like, replication of Al-Hamra quarters, and they realize that you have areas extremely problematic. So I think what I found interesting with paradigm shift concerning caring about the camps, about the habitat, is the community participation, because there where you have amazingly a good a new practice of UNRWA to involve the community in their work. So slowly, UNRWA is trying to get the voice of the refugees in the design and implementation of their programs. But I think the effort so far is insufficient at all. I'm really, I mean, if I look to criticism issued by Palestinian communities about UNRWA, it's mainly about allocation of funding. So, and if you read any criticism from political factions or elsewhere, they always want the best everywhere, in education, in health, dealing with the Palestinian of Syria, etc., etc. And this is, they will keep doing this kind of exercise as far as they are not consulted in budgeting, in budget design. And we know Porto Alegre model. This model is applied now in 2,500 locality worldwide. In United States, United States, this very neoliberal economy, we have almost 200 localities apply Porto Alegre model. It means that you bring people to decide with them, representative of people, I mean, how to allocate budgets. Because once you decide with the beneficiaries that you have X sum and more education mean less health, more health mean less hardship cases intervention. Only by doing this, you resolve this problem of always nagging to say insufficient, this perpetual unsatisfactory feeling. My last point, maybe I will deal with it, is about the camp governance. This is really my contribution in this book, and I start my chapter by quoting Lenin, okay? And Lenin was asked, what is the communism? Okay, he was in one of the universities in Moscow, and he replied, communism is service. No, he said, sorry, is Sovietat plus electrifying rural area. Okay, so for him, what the meaning of a good governance, if you like, is not only just you preach people the moral, but you go and you electrify their rural area. And I think this is UNRWA. It's amazing. It's doing the opposite. It's just providing service to Palestinians without doing, I think, sufficiently effort to help the Palestinians to govern their camps. And I highlight the word helping. I'm not asking UNRWA to govern the camps. And you should, and the title of the article is Phantom Sovereignty. Okay, so they are there and not there. They are again, I should cite this anecdote that I was at the head of Shamil Center for Refugees and Diaspora in Ramallah in early 90s, where Abu Zaid, Karen Abu Zaid was not General Commissioner, but less. And I told her, she gave a lecture, I told her that camp program officers, it's translated into Arabic by camp director, Mudir al-Mukhayyar. Okay, and she said, impossible. This is no way. So I took her to Ad-Dura camp in Ramallah and show her and she took a picture, etc. And of course, nothing changed. It means that, in fact, she knows that, in fact, it's very important for the camp officer to present himself to be respected as a camp director. But then this camp director every time have a comparison things. He said, no, I am just a poor UNRWA officer, things like that. So I think this ambiguity which really created a lot of misunderstanding, mistrust between the community and UNRWA. And we see every time UNRWA involve itself with the camp governance, we have excellent result. Okay, so this is what. So in the article I brought 3-4 examples where it was a change. A little bit, I would not say paradigmatical change, but it changed thanks to initiative. For instance, I like a lot the work of Salvatore Lampardi, because he did excellent work, not only in trying to advocate Palestinian rights vis-à-vis the Lebanese authorities, but also he understood that always this kind of things need leverage. He subsidized, I would say, the first time in the history of UNRWA, UNRWA paid for a demonstration. So our big march for the Palestinian rights in Lebanon, partially paid by UNRWA. So just to, you see, my message is double. Is to say, look, there is possibility of really UNRWA within this very critical mandate to do a lot of things. And I feel sometimes very frustrated. I want them to push them more and more, and I think they can do it. And with this word, I will stop.
Go. Not in the order that is on my list.
This is part of it. Thank you, Sari. Thank you, Tariq. Thank you, my colleagues. My name is Nasser Yassin. I'm the Director of Research here at the Institute, and I teach health policy at the Faculty of Health Science. I come from a development background, so I comment on some of the aspects related to the camp governance, development, and so on. I'll be brief in my commentary, and I'll highlight some positive points, but also I'll be a bit critical. So I have three main points that I'd like to raise, a bit of a critique of the book, or in a positive, constructive way. So this is, of course, this is a much needed volume, and it's edited and written by a fantastic cohort of scholars. You have the seasoned ones, but also you have the aspiring ones. Always interesting to get doctoral students and postdoc to contribute. They bring in fresh views. And of course, it comes in a point where UNRWA is in a context where Palestinians have been suffering and have suffered immensely recently in Gaza and in Syria. So this even brings more weight for the book and for the discussions about UNRWA and its mandate and its way of doing business. And of course, UNRWA has been facing and is facing now a number of challenges, be it organizational, be it related to funding, or actually related to how to cope with such uncertain moment. This long moment of uncertainty in the region, how actually UNRWA can cope with such moment. But I want to focus in my brief commentary on the camps and their governance, a subject that has been addressed either solely in a couple of chapters or as a recurring theme in a number of chapters. You see this covered as a cross-cutting theme in many other chapters. Of course, when we talk about governance, we look at the ways the camps are currently managed, organized, and in some ways how they are controlled. So this is mostly what we want to refer to as governance. As many of us know, and you know, around 1/3 of Palestinian refugees live in 58 official camps in the 5 fields of operation of UNRWA. And the book, specifically the chapter by Berg, actually has comprehensively described the history of building camps. This is really a very interesting chapter, very well written, and it's really comprehensive in looking at the history of the camp. So not only looking at the history of building the camps, but also Berg contextualized this chapter or this history in the administrative and organizational environment in the corridors of UNRWA since 50s and on, as well as the political climate in 1948, but also more interestingly in 1967, and how the host governments were actually making policies and changes in their policies, how to build camps and and the nature of the camp and where to put these camps and so on and so forth. So this is indeed a very interesting historical analysis, and I recommend, if you want to read of course, read all the chapters, but also read this interesting one. With that, I want to, and here I'll start some of my critique. I'd like to raise an issue that's barely discussed in the book. So, and this is mostly related to the ways that Palestinian refugees living outside the camps access services and the ways they run their local committees or communities and how they maintain their neighborhoods. And this has barely mentioned in the book. When you write a book about UNRWA, about 5 million refugees, I was expecting something on Palestinians who live outside the camp. And the book is mostly centered about the camps and the way they're managed, the services in the camps, and so on. And I argue here that UNRWA is actually responsible for those living inside and outside, of course, in all aspects, besides receiving education, health, and social services. In Lebanon alone, there are around now more than 100,000 Palestinian refugees living in informal areas that are not officially served by UNRWA. I mean, they're not officially served in terms of environmental services, in terms of management of the camp, and so on and so forth. And now we have added to those 100,000, around 30,000 Palestinians coming from Syria, and some other Syrians who actually settled in these informal areas. So those Palestinians who are mostly left on their own, They govern, they run their communities through an assortment of self-help mechanisms and through their own informal ways of dealing with the municipalities, dealing with the government, dealing with politicians, dealing with NGOs, dealing with UNRWA, dealing with others. So they've created their own ways of running their communities, and I was expecting something on this regard. Maybe related to how UNRWA would address those Palestinians that are approximately half of the Palestinians living in Lebanon now, how UNRWA can deal with this significant population. I know this is a very thorny issue because it touches on the relationship between UNRWA, the host government, the host communities, and of course the refugees themselves. But perhaps it could have been discussed, and maybe in the future this has to be discussed in terms of the relationship with UNRWA and the role of UNRWA in this regard. My second point is actually related to the issue of politics. I'm not a political scientist, but I think any scholarly work on UNRWA cannot delink it from the politics of our main question here. And here I refer to Palestine and the Palestinian refugees. And in the book, I can't but notice that there is a depoliticization of some of these issues. In many instances, I've noticed that the book focuses on UNRWA's way of doing business. This is great. This is fantastic. And of course, this is great that UNRWA has opened up. We congratulate UNRWA for that. This is not something we know UNRWA was open about. I mean, many of the researchers previously had a lot of issues getting access to UNRWA's documents, UNRWA's internal discussion, and so on. So this is great. But also, I think we need to politicize the matter. And this was lightly done in this book. Perhaps I didn't read all the chapters, to be honest, but I read many of the chapters and I couldn't notice this aspect. The politicization of the Palestinian refugee issue in Lebanon and the other Arab countries. The third point that I've noticed actually is related to the second one. At a number of instances, and more than the normal way, we see praise was given to UNRWA. I'm not going to attack UNRWA in any way. I mean, I appreciate the organization, but let me quote some. Programs are highly cost effective when it comes to health interventions. This is what I put. This is spectacular results. I mean, this is kind of, we're praising UNRWA. It's a highly successful microfinance. And then I quote more. Innovation in a more sustained and systematic effort in improving physical infrastructure inside the camps. I think whoever mentioned this haven't been to the camps recently, not to Shatila or to Ain al-Hilwi. And then I would quote more. Collective decision-making and shared responsibility with refugees. I'm not sure about this aspect. Of course, I mean, I believe UNRWA is doing a great job. But for someone who has engaged with Palestinian refugees, been in the camps, who've been in the informal neighborhoods, I think the picture is a bit different. Be politically correct. I guess we need more, and we needed more constructive criticism. Build on this aspect of shared responsibility, as mentioned as one of the chapters. And I think this is the way forward for UNRWA to move and to be reformed and to be seen as an effective organization in the Palestinian communities. And I want to end with this quote from the book. The sense of injustice, frustration, and disappointment made the refugees irritable and unstable. This was written in 1950 by an UNRWA director. I think this can apply now if you go to any camp and meet any refugee living in these camps. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm Lance Bartholomew's, Director of Legal Affairs at UNRWA. And I've already been quite interested to hear two speakers beforehand. First of all, I would like to welcome the book. I'll do a little bit of show for YouTube of it. I think that it is an important book, and particularly the critical reflection. I think it is important to have critical reflection of UNRWA and a range of discussion about it. And I think the fact that I'm here as a serving official is also evidence that UNRWA is quite happy to hear that criticism and to take it on board. We don't hide away from it. I think also, just drawing on one of the chapters that Tariq referred to, this might be, what at first glance seem a little bit like an historical development. When you have a look at a chapter such as, and I'll come back to Kirsty Beggs because I think that stands out as one of the examples of a young scholar doing excellent work that is simply hasn't been done before but is very important. Just last week in my work I was referring to Kirsty Beggs' chapter. So I want to say here that what is interesting with UNRWA and Palestinian refugees and also with legal work is that the past and even the deep past profoundly impacts the way in which we work and the way that we are informing the way that we move forward. So it's something that is definitely earned its place on the bookshelf in Jerusalem where I work. Now, where I wanted to concentrate on is actually taking up from the last sentence that Tarek closed with, which is also related. Nasser, sorry. I'll get there. Is related to protection and human rights of Palestine refugees. And here there are a few chapters, and this is a golden thread running through the book in terms of human rights. First of all, I would say that now, as ever, there is great concern about the enjoyment of human rights of Palestine refugees throughout all of the 5 fields in which UNRWA operates. And very quickly, to go through them, in Gaza it continues to be the impact of the blockade, which has now run for over 7 years, which has an impact on every facet of life in Gaza. It's the conduct of hostilities very recently in Gaza, July and August, which has had tremendous impact that I've seen firsthand. In West Bank, the continuing occupation of the West Bank, of the occupied Palestinian territory, where we see a number of implications there. We see an increased number of fatalities as a result of the use of live ammunition in so-called search and arrest operations. We see an increased number of demolitions and increased triggers towards forced displacement as a result of demolitions that are closely related to a zoning and planning regime that has been described by the Secretary General and most recently the Human Rights Committee as discriminatory and not in conformance with international law. And we see the continued impact 10 years on of the from the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the wall and the extent to which it deviates from the 1967 Green Line. That's Gaza, West Bank. In Jordan we see issues as well, of course. We couldn't be here in Beirut without saying that the conflict in Syria has had an enormous impact on not just Lebanon and not just Palestine refugees, but for us we see the Syria crisis through the lens of Palestine refugees, and we see the way that those Palestinians who have either fled or have been trying to flee Syria have had real challenges to their enjoyment of their rights under international law, either to be able to flee or once they've fled to a host country to enjoy the rights that they should deserve along with everybody else under human rights. So in Jordan, in Lebanon, we've had already touching upon the exclusion that many Palestine refugees have from the labour market and elsewhere as a result of their status. And in Syria as well, there's tremendous, horrific armed conflict that has left no one in Syria untouched, including the Palestine refugees. So, brief roundup, there's great concern for what is going on. I think moving on to that, what's UNRWA's role in it, I think that even from when the book was done in 2010, from what I would say as somebody who's written on UNRWA's mandate and is concerned with the interpretation of UNRWA's mandate daily, protection as a part of UNRWA's mandate, for us it's a given from the General Assembly. It's how it's put into practice and how you try the enormous challenges of getting a result from your work in protection and making sure that your work is as effective as possible. That's where the challenges lie. I would take issue with the use of the word passive protection. It was one that was in vogue at the time of 1988 when the Goulding report was put out. which was following the beginning of the first Intifada. Passive protection is not what UNRWA does. I would say that from the inside, what we do and what is essential to do is active protection. Now I know that sometimes the way that passive protection is used is a little bit as Sari used it, in contradistinction to seeking durable solutions. But I would suggest that within UNRWA, the phrase passive protection has left the vocabulary because we all see that it's vitally important to actively pursue the protection of Palestine refugees. And I think there's been increasingly sophisticated protection interventions, although the outcomes remain elusive. I think it's also important, now let's come to accountability, that, okay, UNRWA has moved or expanded from relief and works to human development. Unfortunately, with the emergencies that continue to engulf the region, it's not possible to move entirely away from emergency assistance. But accompanying humanitarian assistance, accompanying human development, still has to be a need to assure accountability for violations of international law by all concerned. So this is not a focus on particular states as being the authors of or perpetrators of international law violations, but looking at it from a very focus of Palestine refugees, from a human focus, an individual focus. Here, I'll give a little bit of an anecdote which I think has brought home to me the continued importance of accountability. During one of the pauses in the hostilities down in Gaza during July and August, I went in very quickly and was very concerned to see what had happened for myself, which is very important as a director of legal affairs. Now, I went to one of the shelters where UNRWA was sheltering at the time up to 300,000 people, 6 times more than the peak at which UNRWA had sheltered people during the operation during 2008, 2009. And there I had the opportunity, which I always welcome, to be speaking to Palestine refugees. I went to beach camp and I sat down with one of the families who were from Beit Hanun. They had been one of the first people to come to beach camp, and they knew that their home had been levelled. There was nothing to go back to. I was surprisingly buoyed by the amazing Gaza sense of humour, but also a sense of stoicism, which is a great inspiration to me personally, I think, and quite a motivation working for UNRWA. Now, when I was speaking with them, one of their family there was a newborn child. She was a girl, 10 days old, and had been born in one of the hospitals during the conflict, but had come back to live in the shelter. They said to me, look, we appreciate the food that UNRWA gives, although the father of the family, he did say, look, the cans of tuna, really, after 2 weeks, can we have something else? He said, I miss the smell of some grilled chicken. And I said, look, I'll take back the request for more grilled chicken. We'll see what we can do. It might be a little bit difficult at this stage. But the thing that touched me was a real thirst for justice and accountability. And he said to me, look, what did I do? I'm here. Our home has been destroyed again. How many times before there's justice and that this doesn't happen again? And from that, I see and take a very strong message, and UNRWA has taken generally a strong message. It's not just about giving cans of tuna or even grilled chicken. It's also important to pursue accountability wherever Palestine refugees are. This is important to Palestine refugees, and I think if we're looking at participation of Palestine refugees, UNRWA being open to receiving this message and then taking it on the broader stage has been quite important. So a little bit about, I won't go into all of the things that UNRWA does in terms of actively pursuing protection, but I will give a little bit about just the part in which I play a role with the whole team in terms of protection. One of the things that UNRWA does systematically is to engage with the international human rights system. Since the conference back in 2010, we have a policy in place which is a framework for effective engagement. And what that looks at is engaging where there's protection priorities, engaging where UNRWA has a strength, where it can provide reliable, factual information, and doing so in an even-handed, consistent manner. I'll come back to that, but even just within the last few months, I've spoken at the Human Rights Council special session on Gaza on the 24th of July. We've briefed the Human Rights Committee in Geneva that came out recently with concluding observations on a state's report. We've dealt quite a lot with the Special Rapporteur on the OBT, but also more broadly, special rapporteurs who had a thematic focus, whether on adequate housing, on food, and we don't just touch on the occupied territory, Palestinian territory, which is quite important, but in other areas as well. So this is a little bit of an example of the work that we do. Now after that sort of very pro-UNRWA part here, I think I couldn't come to a conference that's looking for a seminar that's looking at a launch of a book on UNRWA and Palestinian refugees without accepting that there are challenges. And I think here I'd like to acknowledge those challenges and say just a couple of words about them. I think one is neutrality. You often hear, for example, UNRWA is an organisation whose mandate is focused on Palestine refugees. The great majority of our 30,000 staff are Palestine refugees. So how can we be neutral? I think it's a good question, and I think that it is something that I will openly acknowledge is a dilemma and is a continual struggle to do, particularly not just for Palestinian staff, but also for internationals. In my position, for example, you see a lot of evidence of injustice passing over your desk. How is it that you can keep on going with protection but still while remaining neutral? I think while acknowledging that it's a dilemma, I would say that in fact neutrality is essential to being able to perform your protection interventions. I think the well-known saying about those in glass houses, shouldn't throw stones, applies to UNRWA. When we're pointing the finger, we need to look inside to us as well. How do we observe the human right, for example, of children under the Convention of the Rights of Children to participate? This is also part of our mandate. We need to be asking that question very severely and critically of ourselves, because otherwise we lack the credibility to be making interventions. Also, in terms of neutrality, it's also very important that if we end up or our staff end up just focusing on one aspect of protection or one perpetrator, then that doesn't make it very easy for us to be very credible in terms of the protection function. I think as well have to acknowledge that the point made about the politicization of the Palestine refugee issue. This is a great challenge to being an effective intervener on protection issues. It's more than just that no government, no non-state actor likes to have the finger pointed at them and say, we have concerns about your human rights implications. And often in the world of human rights, that is seen as something that's political. But I think particularly in this very politicized environment, there's a perception of the conduct of protection work that has to be acknowledged. And that is that because Palestine refugees are involved, many will quickly come to a perception that when you're talking about human rights and when you're talking about protection, that you're crossing a line somehow from humanitarian work, from something that is firmly in your mandate, to a political aspect of it. And I think we need to acknowledge that this is a real challenge. I think last thing that I'll say here, and I've probably spoken for far too long, is coming back to the book and the way that history informs the present but also informs the future. Lebanon, as I've no need to tell everybody here, is deeply affected by the crisis in Syria. It's been going since March 2011, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon. I think for the future, and where maybe the ninth book to edit, Sari, might be that we are going to possibly have a protracted refugee crisis on the doorstep in the Middle East. And I think there will be questions there to ask, what is it that can be learnt now to deal with that from this very protracted refugee crisis? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Filippo Grandi, and Alex said I'm currently here at Paris Institute as research fellow, but for those of you who don't know, I was also head of UNRWA for a number of years. I left UNRWA just last March. So my views here are going to be a bit mixed. I am outside of UNRWA, but it's a little bit difficult to be that outside of UNRWA only a few months after having left it and after having spent almost 9 years with UNRWA. So bear with me if my perspective will be mixed at best. I also would like to thank, well, Derek, of course, for introducing us and for having me here, which is a great privilege, and Sari for having had this initiative of launching this book. I was at the conference, actually both Lance and I were at the conference in 2010, which was a very good initiative. That was the beginning of my tenure as Commissioner General, the first year, and was also during the first phase of our reform and glasnost or perestroika, whatever you want to call it, to stay with Russian comparisons. And so I think it came as a very welcome moment of reflection on a number of issues that were extremely important for us at that point. And what I wanted to do, and what Sari has asked me to do, is perhaps to look at a little bit at the, Lance looked very much at some of the key conceptual challenges that UNRWA is facing. Let me try to put them a little bit in context for the period that followed the conference from 2010 till now, and that was coincided with the period in which I was leading the organization. I think that I will not say things that you don't know already. Certainly since 2010, in the region, a few geopolitical trends, if you want to call them like this, advanced that had a very important impact on Palestinian refugees and on the work of UNRWA. I'll give you some very obvious examples, but I think it's useful to put everything in that context. One is the so-called Arab Spring in its positive and negative evolution. I think that what was particularly significant for the work of UNRWA and for Palestinian refugees was the way the Arab Spring, or the way politics evolved in Egypt, because that had a major impact and continues to have a major impact on the situation in Gaza. That, of course, it was a determining factor in how the last two Gaza wars, also in themselves major developments of the last few years, went. Both the shorter war of November 2012 and the much more prolonged and devastating war of last summer. The other very important contextual element to be borne in mind is not only the rise but the strengthening and almost unstoppable advance of the extreme right wing in Israeli politics that has really changed a lot in the way Israel and UNRWA deal with each other, which is a significant development for the organization. And in the last few years, we have also seen one more failure of another attempt at the so-called peace process. That also is important because, as you know, the Palestinian refugee question is one of the key components of that process. And last but not least, it has already been evoked by Lance and others, the war in Syria and all that it has meant, not only for Syria, but for the neighboring countries, the region and the world at large. And you could add more elements, but these are perhaps the macro elements that have been very significant and that the book doesn't really deal with because it was written somehow before those elements happened. let's try to link the two and look at at certain types of impact of this situation on UNRWA and the Palestinian refugees. I singled out three. You can have a very long list if you want. The first one is that during the last few years, although the reforms that are described in quite some technical detail in the book, and I agree with Nasser, perhaps some of it is a bit too positive, but it was not written by UNRWA. It was written by other experts. Those reforms continued in spite of the difficult situations, but one fundamental issue occurred, and it has occurred in the past in UNRWA. The book is quite clear in describing UNRWA's current approach as one focusing or wishing to focus on what in UN parlance is called human development. UNRWA doesn't do full development because it doesn't really deal with states. UNRWA deals with people, and therefore, the definition of human development fits quite well what it would like to do, and all the reforms were aimed at that. But conflict in the last few years, more perhaps than ever before, has trumped these efforts and has brought back UNRWA, has forced back UNRWA in many instances, think of Syria, the most significant, into pure relief and emergency work. So when Sari speaks about empowering, which I actually agree with him very much, one has to see it also in that context, in a context in which this kind of effort is continuously jeopardized and made more difficult by the necessity of giving people subsistence for living, cash or food, so that is a very important aspect that need to be taken into account. If you think of some important human development experiments of UNRWA, the book describes very well, and it's very interesting, and it's not very well known, the camp improvement initiative that UNRWA launched almost more than 10 years ago in northern Syria, in the Aleppo region, in Nera bin Ain al-Tal, and how, the book has an interesting critique of that experiment. The reality today is that it has been stopped. It cannot continue because of conflict. So, there are even more dramatic developments that jeopardize those efforts. The whole, Ambassador Houre is here, the whole effort of expanding the right to work, of talking even about the right to work for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon has become much more difficult in the past couple of years because of the influx of Syrian refugees in this country and of some Palestinians as well from Syria. The Gaza reconstruction, the list is very long of such hampered or jeopardized efforts. The second other big impact is had by the failure of the peace process, I would argue, or the umpteenth failure of the peace process, because each one puts a nail in the coffin of solutions for refugees. And that is something that has a very big impact, coupled, I would say, and perhaps this is less thought about, but I spoke about it before leaving office when I came to IFI in February, is the change in the refugee geopolitics, I would say, or even refugee geography that the Syrian conflict is having as an impact. The fact that for the first time ever, I think since 1948, there is an increase in Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. This is quite a factor if you think about it. The fact that Jordan, for example, refused entry to any Palestinian or almost any Palestinian refugee coming from Syria for a variety of reasons. The fact that we now see Palestinian refugees trying to flee as a kind of secondary refuge movement to Europe. Many of them unfortunately died in boats crossing to Europe from Libya into, Tarek will know that very well, into southern Italy. So these are all new developments, and if you put together the umpteenth disappointment in the peace process with the sense of despair that war is causing to refugees in Gaza, in Syria, and in other places, you have a recipe for a very complex situation that may emerge, and I am not sure how much UNRWA is ready, or rather, how much the international community is ready to equip UNRWA to face that particular situation. And this, of course, brings me to the third aspect, which is money. Money is very difficult in UNRWA, as Tariq said at the very beginning, and everybody has mentioned this. The fact that we now, UNRWA now operates in a regional environment where there is another massive refugee crisis, that of Syrians, causes an additional difficulty, generates an additional challenge in terms of raising funds, or rather, it makes it even more difficult for UNRWA to raise funds for its core activities, education, health, social services. It's perhaps less difficult to raise money for the emergency activities that are somehow linked to the broader emergency, but for the core activities, the challenge is becoming almost, extremely difficult to tackle, and puts into question at times the sustainability of UNRWA's core programs. So these are all developments and impact of developments I just summarized for the sake of time. I just want to make a few more reflections before closing. One is that the developments of the last few years also indicate something very clearly. You know, I think it's very significant, and I am happy that the book closes with Leila Hilal's essay on solutions. Because I think that was also, in spite of everything, a little bit the mood in 2010, that still, you know, Obama had just come to power, the Cairo speech, there was some sense that perhaps, in spite of everybody's skepticism, we could move in some direction. But that has been completely betrayed by the subsequent events. So that ending today is significant in what it, you know, in the aspirations that it indicates, but it is also a sad reminder of how those aspirations have not been fulfilled. So clearly, the Palestinian refugee question, I think this is a strong message that should come out today, is here to stay. Is here to stay for the foreseeable future, and perhaps beyond that, the non-foreseeable future. And this is something extremely challenging for everybody. First and foremost for the Palestinian refugees, but then for the, you know, for the host countries, for the international community, and for UNRWA. I think that in that context, in that sense, in that respect, all that has been said this morning, and which is written in this book about protection and advocacy, about the necessity to push further the reforms of UNRWA, in particular, I would say, and that is clearly written in the book, develop better ways to alleviate poverty, which is a big weakness of UNRWA. This is not UNRWA's strongest point, but it is a challenge that is coming up very, very, very strongly. Challenges of refugee participation. All this, I think, is good. This book gives a good foundation for further policy discussion on these issues. There are issues, and this is my slight critique to the book, that in my opinion are not sufficiently developed, perhaps because we felt they were less urgent, pressing in 2010. One is the whole funding and funding mechanism. Remember, UNRWA is an organization that has to pay every month 30,000 employees. 30,000 employees, no other UN agency does that, with voluntary funding. This is a state enterprise that has to function not with taxation, but with, or not with direct taxation, but with the goodwill of governments, which, as we know from the case of Canada, sometimes fails, and therefore the money disappears. So, sorry, Rula, but this is the reality, and I think that this would be worth exploring further. And of course, Lance spoke about neutrality. He spoke very eloquently, as an UNRWA official should do, and I agree with what he says. I found it, and I've said this here in IFI many times, the greatest challenge for me as a Commissioner General, as a leader of the organization, was to deal with this neutrality issue. The Palestinians cannot be neutral. They're party to the conflict. On the other hand, it is also true that as officials of UNRWA, they have to observe UN principles and rules, and they do, by and large. And when they don't, there are sanctions that are applied. But how you reconcile all this is a huge challenge that I have actually proposed to IFI we should perhaps look into more. And then one point that is not tackled here, but which is extremely important, is the staff factor. UNRWA employs 30,000 Palestinian refugees. You know, the international staff is very, very small, is about 150. The rest is all Palestinians, highly unionized, highly politicized also. And, you know, I appreciate, Sari, your point, which is very interesting, the Porto Alegre approach of participation in budget allocation. Remember, UNRWA's budget, I think at the moment it must be close to 90% of UNRWA's budget is salaries. Salaries of teachers, of doctors, that is not salaries of bureaucrats. This is salaries of people that are doing the work. That's what UNRWA is about. UNRWA is about teaching in classrooms and treating patients in the clinics. So that's legitimate money, I wouldn't say that. But that money is almost not fungible, is almost not mobile. There's very little flexibility there. So if we go to the refugees to ask how should we spend the $1.5 billion that UNRWA spends by now every year, they would, of course, have a long list of very legitimate things. But can you move away money from salaries? Can you reduce staff? You would have the unions, who also are Palestinian refugees, on your back saying this is impossible, you can't change that. So that's another major difficulty of managing UNRWA, but something that needs to be looked at. And I just want to close with 2 points. One is the point on governance. I have my own views, but there's no time here but maybe there are questions about that. I appreciate Sari's point about the phantom sovereign. I also think that perhaps one point that should be looked at is, what about the PLO? I mean, the PLO is the representative of all Palestinians, and it says it is, and I respect that. Perhaps if UNRWA has become a phantom sovereign, isn't it because there is a crisis of representation somewhere else that should also be examined, and a representation that is more legitimate than a UN organization that is not mandated, and not equipped to represent refugees? So I think that there is an interesting discussion to be had there. And finally, again, on solutions, I do recommend that besides Leila Hilad's, with whom we've done a lot of work, by the way, on this issue, but there is an essay by Rex Brynan, who is, may I say, my favorite here, on UNRWA as an avatar. I really recommend reading that because it's very entertaining and very politicized, and not politicized, very, it looks at the political dimension of UNRWA. He has a critique there directed at me personally. Rex is a close friend, so I take it in a very constructive way, on involvement of refugees in discussing solutions for their future. He says, and probably rightly so, UNRWA can say until it's blue in its face that refugees should be involved in the discussion when it comes to that, the political discussion on the solution to the refugee question. It will never be the case. You're wasting your time. The discussion the solution, if ever it comes, will be taken in a room by 5 people, and then it will be communicated to everybody, including UNRWA and including the refugees, in a press conference. He's probably very right, but I think that we should continue, and I hope my successor and my successors will continue to argue that there will be no solution to the refugee question, no solution to the conflict, and probably no peace and stability in this region unless the refugees are consulted and are involved in the appropriate ways in this particular discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. There will be 40 minutes, give and take 5 or 10, for discussions. And then there will be a reception. So I don't know what kind of reception that will be, but But there is the reception at 2, and then Sari will be signing books for those of you who want to buy a copy. Would you, Nasser, lead the discussion?
We'll take a first round of questions. We have Dr. Fuad, and please introduce yourself and where you come from.
Thank you. My name is Fuad from the Faculty of Health Science here at AUB. I'm a bit interested about the Syrian crisis, Syrian refugees, and the public health domains of that. Really, it was kind of fantastic, 4 talks. And for the first time, at least in the last 2 years I'm here, to listen to these words like protracted crisis, unsolved issue of refugees, which is at least finally, we have this kind of people that say it loudly. And to start from that, from the experience, the extensive experience of UNRWA dealing with refugees during the last 6 years, and now we're talking about unsolved in the foreseen future. This is good to know exactly, to know how we can deal with this second wave, a huge wave of crisis in the region, talking about the Syrian crisis that flooded, in the neighboring countries, added to the original crisis in the region, and how to learn some lessons from the work of UNRWA on refugees in terms of the title that I'm seeing here, that relief to development. Unfortunately, up till now, dealing with the Syrian crisis is still in this relief work. And I can see that what Filippo said about when in 2010, when they start looking for the development in that, or ambitious about future, the second wave of devastating crisis came and start thinking about the basic. I don't know if the book or your gentlemen can, look for what's the future, how we have these lessons and look for the future as the stability of refugees, or what the way of development in this very political situation and in this very fatigue, let's say, feeling from population themselves. It's not just about government or international, it's about population themselves. I think if we just try to explore that future, hopefully that in the book, which is, I hope I can buy it with the $75, but so it's very expensive, right? So hopefully something there in the book, but if not, that can be kind of, new direction in the future. Thank you very much again.
We'll take a round of 3 questions and then we'll answer. So we have, please, and then.
I'm Livia Wick from the Sociology, Anthropology and Media Studies Department. I have a general question about access to UNRWA for researchers, and in particular to kind of archives, historical research in particular, so not just contemporary, because I think it's very important in understanding our societies to have access to archives in general. Thank you.
Thanks, Livia. Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Razan Diab. I'm actually from the Modern University, right next door to you guys. I'm also a registered nurse from Canada, and so how I'd like to apply relating to your inquiry is some research, and going back to the reference of funding and how much budget is allocated, I was wondering if I'm not sure how it works, but do you outsource, or are you interested in outsourcing different type of funding? For example, I applied to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in regards to conducting research on refugee population in Lebanon, and I'm pretty optimistic in getting the grant. So I'm wondering if UNRWA would want to do something in that regard. And my second point is a lot of media was focusing on the scandals that were happening in UNRWA. For example, the sex scandals with the people participating with the UNRWA, basically. It was talking about, and it was all over the media in regards to asking for different type of sexual needs by the people working there, and it's on YouTube. And I don't teach it. I actually shared it on my public health class that I teach to gather discussion. So I'm wondering, I've never came across research that UNRWA addresses these types of scandals. And even if we go away from the sexual scandals, even the budgeting where the 90% is allocated to salaries, UNRWA never, or I don't want to say never, but there has never been a media release indicating the reasoning behind that. I'm not sure if UNRWA shies away from that reasoning or they just don't want to get associated with the social media. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so we'll have answers and then we'll take another round.
Yes, I will pick.
So you can answer any of the questions
Yeah.
and we'll go around the table.
Okay. Okay. So let me insist about Porto Alegre model. Right. In fact, yes, this is the case. I read a lot about this model, and of course, usually what you put into discussion, not the core funding, the something which is running cost of. I am sure beyond the running cost, you have a substantial sum where, in fact, discussed whether you will alleviate the sewage system in Burj Al Barajni versus, I don't know, the problem of rehabilitation of housing in Ain al Halwi. So always you need, because I followed. I mean, I came to find it. I came to think about this model after really so many discussion happened between UNRWA and refugees, and this perpetual unsatisfaction of Palestinian refugees. That feeling always that UNRWA is not doing sufficiently, etc. Only you can overcome this if really they are involved. If you have people from the community, they know that beyond core funding, how would you deal with many things, including salary increase. I mean, you convince them that if you increase your salary at certain point, this will undermine X or Y or Z. So really here, I insist that you would never end up this a climate of mistrust, chronicle one, without really have this Porto Alegre models. And so the second point is about I like your point, Filippo, when you said, where is the PLO? I mean, why you ask me, and the PLO has a legitimate representative of, and here I would never ask UNRWA to intervene in Gaza, where really you have a community managed, you have sufficiently. You have a governance model where the Palestinian factions, political factions, are managing, if you like, including election, including you will find in the beach camp, for instance, a representative in the municipality of Gaza, which is amazing. I mean, I would say in Gaza you don't have at all a governance crisis in the camps, where here in Lebanon, for instance, it's a major issue. And I saw every time, look, Just take one example. Last example, for instance, it's so telling that Swiss fund come and you say we can resolve the water problems in Shatila camps. You know, Shatila population pay $1 million every month to buy water in Shatila camp. So it's a huge sum. So Swiss fund come with the idea that it will be desalination, but then who would manage the desalination? I mean, the reaction of UNRWA people say, no, not us. And then the popular committees, they saw, okay, but who would, in case, for the maintenance, need a certain sum of money to be collected. So popular committee were reluctant a little bit to say, in case people didn't pay. So how would we do later on? So I followed this discussion. Okay, and I found it really, I mean, it's amazing how UNRWA staff like behaving like bureaucrat. They don't want, I mean, it was an idea of burden sharing. It was an idea. So I think here really I insist in this, the situation of camp governance in Lebanon is disastrous, and you need an external force beyond political factions to resolve this problem. So you cannot just afford, yeah. So I will, just one word for Libya. You know that I will leave Lance but just to say it was a struggle 5 years ago about this. And Lex Steckenberg came with a chart that how researcher can go. I sent a student of mine. She went. It was in the beginning a very weird reaction. Say, come on, who give you the authorization, etc. And then she were able. So you have an ethical committee now inside of UNRWA where you can I can send you the address where you need authorization, but usually I mean they accept the idea that any researcher can access to this archive.
Thanks. Yeah. Questions perhaps addressed to UNRWA, and you're officially representing.
Okay, thank you. Let me say to Olivia, access to serious researchers, UNRWA welcomes it. The process is a bit different to how Sari did it, but it's through the Executive Office of the Commissioner General. So we can swap cards afterwards. There's a process, there's an agreement that's signed by the researcher. So that's not a problem for serious researchers. In terms of the issue of, I think it sounded a little bit more to me of partnerships rather than outsourcing with the Gates Foundation, possible things there. I think that UNRWA is very open to working with these kind of things. So again, let's be in contact. I think enthusiastically looked at. In fact, for going forward, not only in our medium-term strategy currently, but going forward, really this looking at the way that UNRWA can partner with other organisations that are able to do what UNRWA is not able to do is a very important part of our strategy. And then the last one, I wasn't quite sure of the context that you were speaking about the scandals, but what I can say is that it's quite clear within UNRWA that whenever there are credible allegations of something that would amount to misconduct of staff members, there is an investigation, and then there's an appropriate response, whether related to particular staff members that might be involved, or as importantly, a systemic response. So I'm interested to find out a little more about that later.
I think most of has already been answered. I just want to add, again, just to be more clear, because there were at least 2 points. One raised by over there, and I also referred again to the Porta Alegre model. Now, just to be clear, and again, I speak here as a former UNRWA staff, UNRWA has many budgets, okay, like any organization. It has to deal with different things. One, it's called the General Fund. That's its core budget. That's the budget with which UNRWA runs its fundamental activities. Schools, 700 schools, clinics, and the so-called social services, which is really the smaller poverty alleviation program. That's the General Fund. Now, because of the nature of these activities, education is essentially done by teachers and school personnel, and health is done by doctors and nurses and people working in the clinics. The money is channeled through salaries. That's not like, unfortunately that causes a lot of misunderstanding, because there is always, a discourse in the social media, but not just in the social media, everywhere else, in governments, that the UN has high overheads and spends a lot on fat bureaucrats. Now, all that money actually goes to people that are working with the refugees. So it's actually money, first of all, it's money that is a fundamental service, and then it's money that, by the way, goes back into the community. Incidentally, that's also very important. But that's really, by now, it has become 90% of the money, because inflation dictates that UNRWA has to periodically increase its salaries. Actually, it's not inflation. Inflation dictates that governments have to increase salaries in the public sector, and UNRWA's salaries are linked to government salaries in the sense that they are calculated by comparison with government salaries in each country. So because governments continuously increase salaries, and this is, by the way, another major effect of Arab Spring dynamics, that in Jordan, for example, the government, as a response to pressure, increased salaries in the very big public sector, and that obliged us, UNRWA, to do the same. So this is why the bubble of salaries, which is justified but still very big, has increased, and it is now occupying such a huge part of the general fund, leaving little margin of maneuver. Now, it would be very, very interesting. I would actually agree, and I have proposed it to the unions in the past, that perhaps we should put this to the refugees. I mean, do you agree that because if they disagree, then it means that we have to lay off some staff, that UNRWA has to lay off some staff, which is, as you know, a big taboo in many, many ways. Not only because people lose their jobs in situations of high unemployment. In Lebanon, refugees cannot do many other jobs but UNRWA, for example, but also because it would be immediately interpreted as UNRWA pulling back from its mandate. So, it's a very complex situation, and it has to be dealt with very carefully. However, I do agree with you, Sari, there is not just the running cost and the general fund. Although the general fund does, that small, tiny 10% does cover all that you mentioned, the sewage and the maintenance of the schools and the building of shelters and so forth. But there are, other big budgets out there. They are essentially of two types. One is emergencies, food, cash. This is what UNRWA does mostly in Gaza or in Syria today, unfortunately. That's why I'm saying. And that's also not very easy, not very flexible. But there I agree, although it's always difficult to consult beneficiaries in emergencies. I speak from my previous UNHCR experience here. But it is something that perhaps could be done more. And perhaps the area where there could be a Porto Alegre dynamic applied is the third large component of UNRWA's money, which is reconstruction. UNRWA spends a lot of money today in the past 15 years. Since the second Intifada, UNRWA's budget for infrastructure have ballooned because of so much destruction. And so there has to be a lot of reconstruction, starting from Gaza, Jenin, that was before I entered UNRWA, and then Nahr al-Barid, and now Syria will be massive if it ever happens. So there, I think, is an area where there could be. We did, you in yourself in your essay recognize that a lot of this participatory model has been applied fairly successful, and you were involved yourself at the beginning of the Nahr al-Barid planning. I remember because I was the deputy then and very much involved. And I think that is a model that should be studied and replicated. But when we organized in 2012, after this book, after the conference, a youth conference in Brussels, and we gathered a number of young Palestinian refugees. That was the fundamental demand that they put forward, to be more involved. And I remember that they specifically mentioned the budgeting process. So I agree with you that this is an area worth studying, bearing in mind the big constraints.
Okay, we'll take another round. So we have the three. Start with Jabir and then with Mr. Khoury.
I just want to comment on the point raised by Livia about the access to the UNRWA's archive. UNRWA usually is very conservative with respect to this point. Just most recently, Rosemary Saig now is conducting a research on the retired teachers from UNRWA. She asked me for advice. I told her to write to the acting director of UNRWA. The result was it's not allowed. They told her it's not allowed she asked for a list, to provide her with a list of retired teachers and their. I personally, I worked on the UNRWA's archive twice, once with Salim Tamari in late 90s, I think, when it was a project to scan the UNRWA's archive. The second with Eli Yazrek, when we investigated the refugee properties and the family life of the it's worth noting that the UNRWA's archive really has a wealth of information about refugees. All the history of the refugee experience is there in the family file. And this file belongs to the refugees themselves. So though the UNRWA has not any right to deny access to this refugee, to this archive, especially for Palestinians and for also outsiders, researchers. Really, this point needs to be raised. Well, I don't know where, but this is an ethical issue, as Sari said. But this is really considered a problem with UNRWA in this respect. Even if you are doing a research and you are going to interview an UNRWA official, you will hear for the official discourse. Nothing more than the official discourse. You don't know anything more. And you are not allowed to see any paper or otherwise the published or the authorized one. Thank you very much.
My name is Samir Al-Khouri. I'm chair of the Committee for Employment of Palestinian Refugees. The protection issue was raised, and I think it's a very important one. Protection wasn't written into the UNRWA mandate originally, whereas work was. Yet now protection is coming to the fore and work is probably receding. As you know, there is a problem of employment of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And my committee is working to try and change the attitudes, change the laws, which have been changed, but on the ground we haven't seen any progress. So I believe that work and employment should come under the protection mandate. And I didn't hear anyone from the podium mentioning the employment as part of the protection issue. It is viewed, I think, by UNRWA as a part of the protection. I don't know whether they look at it as passive protection, which seems to be passé now, but in actual fact, when Palestinians are allowed to work and work freely and engaged in all employment, they will be protecting themselves because they will be gaining income, and with income they can improve their lot and progress a lot more, and it would relieve part of the relief burden of UNRWA with regards to Palestinians. On November 29, which is the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, we are planning a rally in front of Esquire to try and keep this issue alive and as an expression of solidarity with the Palestinian people. And I hope many of you will join us in this rally. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The lady, yep.
Hello, my name is Manar Hamoud. I just have one question. You've mentioned that UNRWA's role in protection has been not passive, and you made a point out of it. Can you give us an example of active protection, please? Thank you.
We'll have another question. Yeah, please. We'll have more.
Hi, first of all, thank you very much for the conference. It's been really interesting. So I would just like to ask one simple question about going back to the salary issue on the 90% of funding going to the staff of UNRWA. Is it true, as you said, that, for example, in Jordan, the salaries in general were increased because of inflation or whatever? So I would like to ask how fair are actually in the West Bank, for example, since, as we know, there have been several strikes, last one in January, for example. So according to the lifestyle that there's in West Bank, which is pretty not really balanced, like the daily money you spend every day is not really equal to the salary. So I would like to ask how fair these salaries are, and what is your opinion on the strikes that we've seen this year and last 2 years?
Okay, we'll start with, okay, yeah, Mr. Khouri.
I have a small comment or question. Is the book going to be online? Because it's pretty expensive, and if you want it really to be read, it has to be online as well. Thank you.
It's a shame. It's a shame the price of the. Please boycott it. I am an author and I'm asking you.
Okay, so let's start with Filippo. We'll answer this way. Have anything to comment on something? And then Sari, briefly.
Yeah, perhaps I leave Lance to respond to some of the more specialized protection questions, but Ambassador, I definitely, sorry if I did not come across in that way, but certainly the right to work issue is a very major protection issue. And by the way, if I can make also a comment to that, when I perhaps a bit hastily concluded, I said that given the developments in the past few years, the war in Syria, the changes in Egypt, the blockade of Gaza, the right wing in Israel, the failure of the peace process, I forgot perhaps to mention the division of Palestinian leadership. These are all very important factors. It is very, very clear, and I think you're absolutely right, that in the future, protection will grow in importance as a focus for UNRWA. And I don't think that the assistance part, the works or the relief will go away. On the contrary, the relief will probably increase as well, but certainly the protection part. And this is when I said UNRWA should be better prepared, I mean that. My background is more UNHCR, and I know how an agency responds to protection crisis. I don't think UNRWA is fully equipped yet to do that. That's a critique that I make of the agency I work for, and I take responsibility for not doing enough in that area, but I think it is definitely a very big challenge for the future. I just want to talk 2 minutes about the salaries. First of all, you see, I always hesitate to mention this issue of the 90%, not because it is not known, it's in every document, but because it is immediately interpreted as a sign of bureaucracy. And no matter how much you repeat that this is salaries of teachers, is not the salaries of a person behind the desk filling forms. It's the salary of the teacher, and without a teacher you have no education. It is immediately, and I'm not suggesting you do that, but in the collective psyche it resounds negatively. And yet there's no other way to deliver the assistance except through people who need salaries. But I just want to clarify this. The salaries of the staff of UNRWA are calculated on the basis of the corresponding salaries for the same categories in the government of the area in which the staff are. So in Jordan, Jordan, in Lebanon, Lebanon. In Palestine, in occupied Palestine, the comparator is the Palestinian Authority. Now there is a very huge debate in the West Bank because they say, well, we have Israeli prices and Palestinian salaries. That's fundamentally what they say. That's why UNRWA, just like the Palestinian Authority, provides additional allowances in Jerusalem, for example, to staff working in Jerusalem, where the prices are very different from Ramallah or Hebron or other places. So, you know, do you ask me if they are fair or not? I think they're on the low side in certain categories especially, but the management contention with the unions back in January, and I was still in office, so I was very much involved, was that their demand for salary increases were not justified by any corresponding increases in the Palestinian Authority salaries. Otherwise, we would have had to do it. But we made a study, and you know, they were still actually above the Palestinian Authority salary. So in that sense, they were fair. They were fair in that they reflected the rules and norms. But you know, whether they are enough for a big family to survive, that's unfortunately beyond UNRWA's capacity to respond.
Thank you. Just to address some of the others, I think, thank you, we appreciate the views on access to archives, and I think this is something that we need to continue the dialogue, because I think that we acknowledge that it is important that outsiders, and that particularly academics who have the time and also the skills of analysis to have access to our records so that they can do important work such as we see in the particular book. I would say, though, that there are a couple of things. First of all, access to individual information. It's not just ethical, it's also a legal responsibility that UNRWA has to protect the individual information of Palestine refugees. And it's something that it's not only academics, it's also host governments, it's other governments as well that would like to know all of the details about our Palestine refugees, where they came from, how old are they. Now, these ones for normal academic, you know, you might think, okay, for me, I'm trustworthy, that'll be fine. But we need to think that, also coming back to the politicisation, there are particular issues here. But first and foremost is one that whenever an institution such as the UN or the government has private information concerning donors, banks as well, often it's the informed consent that is actually needed of each individual to have access to that information. Now, we've been a little bit more relaxed about that when we've come to the access of researchers, in that there might be access to some of the individual information, but that has to be tightly controlled. And we've frankly got a very strong responsibility to each of the Palestine refugees to do that. When it comes out, though, I think the way that we try to deal with that tension is that there should not be any data taken away that would relate to individual details. And when there are analyses of all this data, it should be in a generic sense. So I think it can be managed, but I think particularly when there are requests to have all of UNRWA's information about all of its refugees in a way that could be freely manipulated, there are some issues about that, but happy to work through that. I think as well, interviews with UNRWA officials, I think it's one that we are more open to doing now, but I think we have to recognise that in this day of YouTube and of splicing of films, any official who goes on record about what is done has to be very careful. And I think I would like to say that we try to push the boundaries as I hope that I have today. I haven't appeared to you, I hope, as trying to sanitise anything in it, but we do need to be careful about what goes on in the public domain because it will be used for a variety of purposes. Having said that, I think we're open to engagement with academics and other studies who regularly come through and want to speak to officials about what really goes on. I think just in terms of active protection, an example, let me give you two brief ones. One are the gender-based violence referral schemes that UNRWA has established in the last several years, ones that I think still need further development. But in Jordan, for example, you see through UNRWA's programs, both through the health centres and through the schools, there's a rich ability of our frontline staff to be picking up indications of gender-based violence. We don't have the expertise or the authority to deal right through to the end in terms of gender-based violence, but we will deal we will have MOUs in place in Jordan, for example, with specialist NGOs who are able to deal with these very delicate matters. And they, in turn, will deal with, say, the Family Protection Unit in Jordan, which has one of the better reputations for dealing with gender-based violence in the region. So there's a very active way that we deal with things, and also partnering that we talked about. Another one that I'll give as an example is in the West Bank. There's a couple of ones that you can see, Al-Walaja, a village, and also Khair in the Hebron Hills. Now what we do is that both of these villages, for different reasons, are under threat of demolitions and of displacement. So what do we do actively? We don't just go along and say, okay, let's report on this, let's have a look. We do something that I think is UNRWA is well placed to do in terms of active protection, which is we combine the programmatic part of our protection with the advocacy part, public and private, of the advocacy. So what we'll do is that there will be, with the job creation program and with small grants, you promote the resilience of the refugees so that they're less vulnerable to moving. If there is a demolition, you respond to it. There is also something of community mobilisation, for example. So we will give support, either identifying partners, doing what networks do everywhere. Yes, I think that the Norwegian Refugee Council may well be able to provide legal assistance to you if there is a demolition order that's placed. We'll put you in contact with the lawyer, with NRC. They have some lawyers who are admitted in the Israeli courts, so there could be something there. You use your networks. As well as that, there's the private diplomacy, which is that when diplomats often approach, and journalists often approach UNRWA to say, please show us what is going on, then we will come to villages like Al-Walaja or Khair and say, okay, this is emblematic of what's going on. You speak to the people yourself. So it's also giving a voice to Palestine refugees. We'll also give a bit of a briefing. And then there's the more public advocacy side there, where there are these issues, we will raise them in various fora, the International Human Rights System fora, in the media as well. And I think that when you put that together with our partners, because it's not just UNRWA who is able to do this, that's what I would give as just one example amongst many that I could give of a sort of holistic, active role to trying to protect the rights of Palestinian refugees to the best of our collective ability.
Yeah. I would like press 2 points as a matter of concluding for Fuad and about the politicization. I would first I would not put it in dichotomous way, neutrality and politicization. I would put neutrality and partisana, I mean being partisan. And I think that the Palestinian refugee, as you said it, Filippo, rightly, is a very political issue. So we should not disqualify someone make a political statement as if it is against the neutrality. I mean, we should always be sure that there is no parties to be partisan while something when there is a statement or action or something like that. And this is what lead me to the question of employment. For instance, I would never understand the position of the former director of UNRWA in Lebanon. That she told me she went to Ministry of Labor and Lebanese Ministry of Labor, and he told her he will not apply the law, Lebanese law, okay? Sick. And when she told me this, I said, did you go to the Prime Minister? Why you don't speak? Do you want me, I send you a journalist where go naming and shaming, even, I mean, because this is very serious things. Okay, this story, it was almost 1 year ago. And she said, no, this, in any case, it's not in our mandate to work on employment. So it means that UNRWA, unfortunately, some of staff, they are not take it seriously, the question of unemployment, as one of the really basic rights for Palestinians. So here, in her mind was, it's a politicization to ask her to name and shame. And I think this is a extremely important, and this kind of low profile, which allow this minister until today even not to give employment for secretary at EUB, Palestinian secretary or something like that. More than that, and because there is a silence about this Minister of Labor, that even they are now using more racist vocabulary, say we don't want black people, we don't want something like that. So this is again, I think international organization, international community should really level to its responsibility to stop such things. And finally, I think the issue of lesson learned from between, I would say it's a mutual. I hope UNRWA learn from UNHCR how UNHCR now dealing with protection of Syrian refugees, because we have many problems with the Palestinian refugees, for instance, from Syria, that they are fled Syria and they need protection, and here it's not a safe for them. And so I think UNRWA has a serious gap in its mandate to really to think about permanent solution, to things beyond just how to alleviate the basic need in the host society. And in the same time, I would say, I saw the new international organization coming to Lebanon for to start working on Syrian refugees. I found it's a lot of doubling efforts sometimes, and I wondering why we don't use really UNRWA infrastructure. They have amazing infrastructure. Not to duplicate many efforts done with UNRWA. I think UNRWA is very well established here in Jordan and Syria, and can really UN can give it some extra mandate to deal with the Syrian refugees.
Okay. So the last word to.
Well, I just thought I should respond to a couple of points that Sari just made, just to be clear. Otherwise, we're left, in my opinion, with some ambiguity here. First of all, if the former director, there's two different things here. One is what she told you, if that's what she told you, that this is not UNRWA's business. That's obviously wrong. It is UNRWA's business. You yourself said in your first intervention that the previous director was actually very much engaged in this issue. So
I'm talking about another one.
Yeah, okay. So I think we should not personalize. UNRWA is made of people, and some are good, some are less good, and also some have methods that others have not. And I think that, one of the things that we did through the reform, maybe it was a mistake, was to decentralize some of these approaches and to allow people in the field to adopt whatever strategies and approaches they wanted to tackle certain problems. Of course, there was an overall sense of direction given by me, by my office, but definitely there was more freedom, and that freedom perhaps at times was counterproductive in this particular case. If that's true, I wasn't there to witness, that is a mistake. And Ambassador Khoury knows very well that UNRWA was involved in the debate. I don't think that UNRWA is alone in this particular endeavor in fighting for expanded rights for Palestinians in Lebanon, especially when it comes to right to work. ILO has an important mandate, of course. This is its universal mandate. The government has the key implementing role and also policy-making role, and there's NGOs and donors and others involved. So it's a partnership effort. But definitely it is something that UNRWA has been involved. I just want to dispel that, but not the mistake of one person or the other that are always, can argue, but definitely the direction. One thing that I would like to say, though, is that I speak at least for the time when I was still in office, compared to efforts made at the beginning, in 2005, 6, 7, it became more difficult to discuss this matter when Syrian refugees started arriving by the hundreds of thousands in this country, for obvious reasons. When it comes to right to work, it was not the best moment to make huge public statement in favor of that, which could have been counterproductive. So I make a little pitch here that perhaps that approach of being a bit lower profile had a reason at that particular time. I don't know. Maybe it was wrong. But it has always to be seen in context. I only want to say another issue about the second point that you raised.
About UNRWA versus UNICEF.
No, not versus, for God's sake, no. But about the two. I think that, and Lance actually could speak much more competently than me on this one. We at UNRWA, since I think 2006 and 7, established a practice of a yearly exchange with UNHCR. This didn't exist before. But because both my predecessor and I came from UNHCR, that facilitated things. And that was very useful, especially in learning lessons on protection. So definitely. So that, in terms of how you do active protection, definitely we benefited. Lance can testify. However, one has to be a bit careful. I see your point that UNRWA could offer, well, I'm not so sure that its facilities would be able to deal with how many there are now, 3 million Syrian refugees. But I don't know if that is a feasible proposition. I think that, let's be practical. Politically speaking, today, there will not be any appetite to expand UNRWA's mandate in any possible way. Rather, unfortunately, the appetite out there is more to reduce it. I'm talking here about pro-Israeli groups in America, people in Congress, in Canada. There's been a strong drive to actually reduce UNRWA's mandate. So I think that it is not historically the moment to do that, not because of capacity or not, which I agree with you could be argued, but in political terms, related in particular to the peace process situation.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very interesting, very exciting. Now we have a reception, and Sari can sign the book if the $75 can afford the $75 mark of the book. Thank you very much on behalf of the Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. Stay tuned to our activities and hope to see you soon. Thank you.